Ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome Professor Justin Yifu Lin, Senior Vice President and Chief Economist of the World Bank. The Chinese University of Hong Kong is greatly honored to have invited Professor Lin to deliver a lecture on the university campus today. Now, may I invite Professor Lawrence Lau, Vice Chancellor of the Chinese University of Hong Kong, to deliver a welcoming address. Professor Lau, please.
Professor Justin Lin, Mrs. Lin, distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon to you all and welcome to the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Today we are most honored and privileged to have with us as our distinguished speaker, Professor Justin Lin, also known as Lin毅夫, Professor and Founding Director of the China Center for Economic Research at Peking University, who is also to become, very soon, Senior Vice President and Chief Economist of the World Bank in a couple months. Professor Lin is going to deliver a lecture on this area of expertise, the development and transition, idea, strategy, and viability. I'm extremely grateful to him for coming to our campus to share with our faculty and students his wisdom and scholarly insights. Born in Taiwan, Professor Lin left Taiwan in 1979 and became a student at Peking University, where he earned his master's degree in political economy in 1982. He pursued further studies in economics at the University of Chicago under the supervision of Professor Theodore Schultz, Nobel laureate in economic science, and obtained his PhD in 1986. From 1986 to 1987, he was a postdoctoral fellow at Yale University's Economic Growth Center. Professor Lin returned to China in 1987 and began his research on China's economic and agricultural reforms, including the modernization of the rural areas. He became a full professor at the Peking University in 1993 and founded the China Center for Economic Research, CCER, in 1994, of which he has served as director ever since. Under his leadership, the CCER has attracted many renowned Chinese scholars and researchers to return from abroad who have made significant contributions to both China's economic reforms and the advanced studies of the Chinese economy. Professor Lin is well known for his work on fiscal decentralization, enterprise reform, urban and rural modernization, and agricultural innovation and reform. He has held visiting professorships at eminent universities around the world, including Duke University, Australian National University, and the University of California at Los Angeles. And I should add that he actually also served at our sister institution, the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. He is the author of 16 books, including The China Miracle, Development Strategy and Economic Reform, which has been published in 7 languages, and State-Owned Enterprise Reform in China, which is available in Chinese, Japanese, and English. He has published over 100 articles in international journals and collective volumes on history, development, and transition. He has received many prestigious awards, including the Sun Yefang Prize, which is China's highest honor in the field of economics. A leading Chinese economist, Professor Lin has played an important role in China's economic modernization and opening up. He is currently Vice Chairman of the All China Federation of Industry and Commerce and a member of the 11th National People's Congress National Committee. He also rendered his professional expertise to major international organizations, including the United Nations Millennium Task Force on Hunger, the Eminent Persons Group of the Asian Development Bank, and the Working Group on the Future of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. He is now a member of the Chief Economist Consultant Team at the World Bank and the Consulting Committee at the Asian Development Bank. As I said, in 2 months' time, he will be the first economist from a developing country to hold the prestigious position of Senior Vice President and Chief Economist of the World Bank. Justin is an old friend and a collaborator of mine. I've known Justin since 1986. I first met him in the United States. And we've been friends and collaborators ever since. So I'm very proud of Justin and very grateful for him for coming to address us today. This afternoon, Professor Lin is going to share with us a new approach to understanding the economic development and transition of developing countries. In order that more can benefit from his wealth of knowledge and rich experience, today's lecture is broadcast live to our sister institutions in Hong Kong and to leading universities on the mainland. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me now in welcoming one of the most influential economists of our time, Professor Justin Lin. Thank you very much.
Professor Lau, ladies and gentlemen, it's a true pleasure for me to give a talk this afternoon. It is because Chinese University of Hong Kong was the place that I gave my first academic seminar right after I obtained my PhD from the University of Chicago. And 2 of my books mentioned by Professor Lau, The Chinese Miracle and also The State-Owned Enterprises Reform, were also published by the Chinese University Press. And so it's a true pleasure for me, before I go to World Bank, to share with you my observations and ideas about the important issue of economic development and transition in China. And hopefully, my observation about China will also be applicable to other developing countries in the world, and to facilitate me to perform my function at the World Bank. This is an important issue because if we look into the world history, before the Industrial Revolution was a modern time, most countries in the world were in a situation of backwardness, stagnant, and agricultural lives. And during that time, China and some part of Japan and India were richer than Europe. But the difference of per capita income in the rich part of the world, like China, and the poor part of the world, like in Europe or in Africa, was at most 30%, but no larger than 50%. But after the Industrial Revolution, a great divergence started to occur, and the gap is widening. Now, the difference between the rich country and the poor country, the per capita income can be 30 times, 40 times larger or smaller. So for the poor country, how to catch up the developed country to become modernized is a dream for all the people in the developing part of the world. And we know, after the Second World War, most of the poor region, they become politically or economically independent. And under the leadership of their first generation leaders, they started to pursue their own modernization and industrializations. However, only a few economies in East Asia achieved this goal of catching up with the developed country. And most other countries, in effect, failed. And their gap with the developed country, as I just mentioned, become larger and larger. And starting from late 1970s, China and other socialist economies started a process of transition to a market economy with the hope that will stimulate their economic growth in order to catch up with the rich country. Certainly, China and Vietnam achieved dynamic economic growth ever since in the past 30 years. However, countries in Eastern European countries and the former Soviet Union, they started the same process, but they encountered transition collapse and stagnation. Not only so, starting from late 70s and early 1980s, other developing countries under the advice of World Bank, IMF, also started a process of reform their economy. And a similar situation occurred to them. Their economic performance did not improve. And some economists refer that as a lost decades to the developing countries. And so the question to me and to many people here is that why did Japan and the four small dragon in East Asia succeed, but most other developing countries fail in their attempt to modernize their countries? And why did China and Vietnam have a dynamic growth after their transition, but most other developing countries and former socialist countries encounter some kind of collapse and a stagnation and a crisis in their reform and the transition process? In effect, this is a question asked ever since Adam Smith published his book, The Wealth of Nations. Why some countries are rich, but other countries remain poor? And this question, just like Robert Lucas, when he was invited to give the Marshall Lectures in 1985, he said, the consequence for this large difference in income level for human welfare involved in question are simply staggering. Once one started to think about them, it is hard to think about anything else. And for me, actually, it's a question in my mind in the past 30 or even 40 years. Always in my mind, try to find an answer to that. Well, if we want to understand why some countries are richer and some countries stay poor, we need to understand what determines a country's stage of development or the level of development. And certainly, economists provide several studies and analysis. At the beginning, most people think natural resources was important. And later on, people think physical capital is important. And starting in the 1970s, 1980s, people started to think that human capital is crucial. And now, technology is the key. However, gradually people agree. These are just the approximate causes of the development. Just like we say, rich people, certainly they have a lot of money. But why they have a lot of money is the issue we need to understand, right? And so we need to look into the so-called deep or fundamental causes of economic development. Then economists provide different competing hypotheses. Some say it's due to luck. Some say it's due to that your geography is good, you have good transportation, you're close to the rich country, or you have good institution, or your culture is more favorable for the modern development, or you adopt some kind of open policies, you emphasize trade. Certainly, all hypotheses can explain certain aspects of the success, but now most economists think that institution is the key, because institution will determine the incentive for work, the incentive for accumulation, the incentive for innovation. And if you have good institution, then you can have those kind of proximate causes of success. Okay, but institution is a result of human effort. Then we need to ask, what determines a country to have a good institution or other country to have bad institution? So far, most economists try to understand this from the angle of conflict of West interest group. They think that most of the bad institution was because of a result of conflicting between the goal of different West interest group. And economist Michael Olsen say, if a country to have a long duration of stability, they are going to form some kind of distributional coalition which will try to design policy in order to distribute income to them. Then we are going to have bad institution. Then trade economists like Grossman and Helpman, they say, well, most of the bad institution was you have some group of people who bribe the government in order to protect them from the competition of trade and so on. So they think it was just like, bribery and so on, resulting in this kind of bad institution. Then recently, famous economists in MIT and Harvard say, like Asimoglu, Johnson, and Robinson, they studied the Latin America, North America, and Central and South America. Latin America, they say, well, the North America country, they have good institution, and South America country, they have bad institution, was because at the beginning of their colonial periods, the death rate in the Central and North America was extremely high, and so the colonial, they cannot expect to stay there for long. So they formed some kind of institution to grab. But the weather and so on in the North America result in a low death rate. So the colonial people stay there, so they brought the good institution from Europe to there. And that's the reason why North America is rich and South and Central America was poor. Other economists also look at similar cases, but they explain this from a different angle. They say, well, because of this endowment structure in the North and the South is different. In the South and Central America, it was good for some kind of plantation. And so they can employ slaves and so on to work. And those kind of institutions have some kind of legacy up to today. But in the North America, they have small farms and work by the white people. So they have a more egalitarian institution, and that is good for democracy and so on. So all look into from the angle of conflict of interest group. But my question is that, why did NIEs in the 1960s, Chile in the 1970s, China and Vietnam in the 1980s started to take off without observable changes in the composition of their West interest group? So to me, West interest group theory cannot provide the answer to this puzzling phenomenon. And I personally try to provide a new angle. I think the most important is the idea, it's a dominant social thought. Just like Keynes said, at the end of his most famous general theory, he said that, but sooner or later, it is ideal, not vested interests, which are dangerous for good or for evil. And why idea is so important? Because according to my professor, Theodore Schwartz, in one of his articles, he says, the dominant social thought shaped the institutionalized order of society. That means that the institutional arrangement in a country was shaped by the dominant social order. And what is social thought? The social thought consists various political and social economic ideas. And this idea tells us what's wrong with the existing system, institution, and what should be the alternative for this society. That is the so-called dominant social thought, or the ideas. And how come the idea can affect the institution in our country? We need to have another building block, that is government. Because from what I see, the government is the most important institution in our country. Why it is the most important institution in our country? Because membership in our country is universal. You have no choice. Secondly, the government has the power of compulsion on its citizens. Because of these two natures of the government, the function or the quality of the other institution in the country, in effect, was shaped or affected by the government's policy. Therefore, the quality of government or the quality of the government policy determine the success or failure of a country's development process. Then we need to understand how come you have good policy or bad policies? Well, the policy is determined by the government, but the government is run by political leaders. Therefore, if we want to understand the quality of the government, the quality of the policy, we need to understand the motivation of the political leaders. And the motivation of political leaders, I think in all the developing countries, or even in the developed country, are mainly for two. One, they want to have their tenure security. They want to maintain their influence in the country. And certainly, they all want to have a high status in the history. That should be the most important motivation for the political leaders. I think monetary gain would be second compared to these two. Okay. And what is the best way for a political leader to secure their tenure and historical position? I think that is to bring prosperity to their nation. If they can do that, they will have the tenure security. If they can have that, certainly they will have a high status in the country's history. However, how to bring the prosperity to a nation is a very complicated issue. We have so many good economists since Adam Smith to study this issue. But so far, we still do not have a consensus. Or so far, we do not have a handbook that really the political leader can follow. And since it's so complicated, and the political leader have some kind of bounded rationality to understand this issue. So under this kind of situation, to follow the dominant social thought, which tell us what's wrong with the existing system and what should be the good alternative for the country, would be a setback for the political leaders. Not only so, if you follow the dominant social thought, then it will be much easier to mobilize the public support for your policy. So under this kind of situation, certainly the policy in a country is influenced by the dominant social thought at that time, through the political leader, through the government. But my hypothesis, why so many countries with a good attempt, they fail. It is because, from what I see, for the long-term economic development, continuous technological innovation is the foundation for sustained dynamic growth. Why after the Industrial Revolution, the economic growth rate increased more than 40 times compared to the pre-industrial revolution? It was because after the Industrial Revolution, the rate of technology changes accelerated. So that is the key. And if a country has the right institution to exploit the advantage of backwardness, then the developing country could have a very low cost for their technological innovation. And then they can catch up the developed country in one generation or two. However, most of the bad institutions, what I observe, are shaped by the inadequate ideas about the priority of technological changes. Most developing countries, at a low-income basis, they want to develop the most capital-intensive, most advanced industry at that time. And this kind of wrong perception of ideas cause they need to introduce all kinds of bad institutions. I will give more analysis later. And why during the transition process, only a few countries succeed in promoting their economic development, and all other fail. Again, it was due to wrong ideas about the transition. Because in a transitional economy, due to the wrong strategy they pursue in the past, they must have a lot of non-viable firm in the economy. And the distortion, in effect, was some kind of endogenously decided second-best alternate arrangement for protecting those kind of non-viable firms. But in the transition process, most government and economists ignore this kind of endogeneity in the distortions and so on. And they try to get rid of those kind of distortion immediately. And they turn the economy from the so-called second best to the third best. Certainly, they are going to have worse economic consequence. And that all comes from the wrong perception, wrong ideas. Okay, let me start my explanation. Because of the divergence between the high-income country and low-income country only occurred after the Industrial Revolution. And industrialization, especially the development of big heavy industry, was viewed by the developing country as a key to economic prosperity and political independence. And especially the experience of Germany in the late 19th century and the Soviet Union's industrialization understanding in the 1930s provide them the confidence of this kind of approach. Okay. And so if you look back, like Sun Yat-sen said, that development of key and basic industry is a priority of China's industrialization. And Mao Zedong said similar things. Without the industries, there can be no solid national defense, no well-being for the people, no prosperity and strength for the nation. And he also, even we become politically independent, but if we do not develop heavy industry, we may become subordinate to other countries, even if we obtain political independence. Now the Chinese leaders had this kind of perception. Indian leaders like Nehru also have similar ideas. He said that big industry must be encouraged and developed as rapidly as possible. And it should be heavy in the basic industry, which is the foundation of a nation's economic strength, on which other industry can gradually be built up. And he also said, no country can be politically and economically independent unless it is heavily industrialized and has developed its power resources to the utmost. So all the senior political leaders, revolutionary leaders, they have similar ideas of develop heavy industry, capital-intensive industry, modern industries. And this kind of idea also is quite prevalent among intellectual leaders. Like Marx, according to his book Das Kapital, he divides the economy into two sectors, the production of means and the production of consumer goods. And he thinks the modernization process should be based on the faster production of means of production, that is the heavy industry. Okay. And also, according to a Latin American economist Prebisch and a German economist Singer, they also, based on their observation in 1930s, they argue, for the developing country, if they focus their production on the export of natural resources, they will be exploited by the country which develop manufacturing sectors. And so they argue for a developing country to avoid being exploited, they need to develop manufacturing sectors, capital-intensive sectors. And also, not only they need to do that, who should do that? They argue government should do that because like List in the late 19th century argue for a developing country, the manufacturing sector, heavy industry sector was like an infant industry. The government need to give them protection and subsidies and so on. And in the 1950s, when the development economics become a separate discipline, they also argue because there's a lot of market failures, and they need to have a government to intervene in order to overcome the market failure to develop heavy industries. And in effect, World Bank, IMF, and other international agencies like UNDP and so on, after the Second World War, also promote the government intervention in order to achieve quick industrialization. So that's some kind of dominant social thought at the time. However, this kind of social thought is incorrect. Now, if you look back, the political leaders' aspiration was a social elite's aspiration for developing heavy industries. It's normal. But the failure to have advanced heavy industry in the developing country was not because of the market failure. It was because of the heavy industry was inconsistent with their competitive advantages. And a firm in those kind of sectors is not viable in an open competitive market. And I'll show that. Supposedly, we have a very simple economy that only have two-factor input, labor and capitals. And which industry that you should go. The more labor-intensive I industry or more capital-intensive K industry certainly depends on your ISO cost curve. And ISO cost curve is determined by your endowment structure. If you are rich in labor force and skills in capitals, you should go into the more labor-intensive industry and vice versa. However, most people think that to produce in the capital-intensive industries is the symbol of modernization that should be bring into the low-income country immediately. And under this kind of situation, it go against their endowment structure, it go against their competitive advantages. And I call this attempt as competitive advantage defining strategies. And a firm in the competitive advantage or CAD strategies will be non-viable. Because from this chart, you can see if their endowment structure determine the ISO cost curve like this flatter curve, and you want a firm to produce it at K1, the cost will be higher. They are not compatible. They cannot survive without external subsidies and protection. And because of viability issue, the government need to give those firms in the non-competitive sectors some policy support. And the government certainly can have several ways of support. One is direct subsidies. But this is feasible only the firm you want to protect is very small. But when a country adopts this kind of CAD strategy, the industry they want to develop was very large. Many, many firms, so under the kind of situation, direct subsidy is not feasible. So they need to make some distortion in trade and interest rate, foreign exchange rate, and so on. And all those kind of price signals will be distorted. With this kind of price distortion, certainly they are going to have shortage in credit, in foreign reserve, in capital, in natural resources, and so on. And then they need to have a national plan and use an administrative way to allocate those kind of resources to the non-viable form in the priority sectors. And by this, certainly they will be able to mobilize resources to set up the modern sectors, just like in China. In 1960s, we were able to test the nuclear bomb. In 1970, we were able to launch the satellite. However, it's going to have some consequence of this distortion. That is so-called ransacking. People will try to bribe the government to give more protections. And if they lose money, they will always come to the government and say that we don't have enough protection. And under that kind of situation, economists give them a name called the soft budget constraints. And certainly, incentive is distorted, resource allocation is distorted, and so on. They are going to be very inefficient. And for a developing country, there are an alternative strategy I call comparative advantage following strategies. This strategy tries to create some kind of enabling institution to facilitate the firm to follow the economy's comparative advantage, determined by the country's endowment. And under this kind of strategies, all the firms will be in the sectors which they have comparative advantage, they will be viable. Since they are viable, the government does not need to protect them. Okay, so you don't need to distort the economy. But the firm will choose the technology or industry according to the price signals. And so under this kind of situation, you need to have some kind of relative prices that will reflect the relative scarcity of the endowment in your country. And only the market institution can do that. So for a country to follow the comparative advantage, they need to have a market institution. They need to be a market economy. But for a developing country, in addition to develop the market institution, in order to have this kind of right relative price to guide the firm's choice of technology, product, and industries, the government in a developing country can play more active role than the minimum government. It was because when you adopt this kind of CF strategies, the firm, the country can benefit from the advantage of backwardness. Their technological upgrading will be very fast. Their economic growth will be very fast. And under this kind of situation, they also need to upgrade their industry very fast. When they upgrade the industry, the firm will encounter several issues. The first one is the information issue. Which industry to upgrade? Which new technology to adopt? That requires information. But we know information requires investment in the gathering, in the processing. But once you gather, you process it. To allow one more firm to understand that, the cost is zero. So under this kind of situation, we know information has a property of public good. Secondly, it's not only an information. The industrial upgrading requires many coordination, both in the financial requirement. When you start with a very low income stages, you invest in very labor-intensive industries, which does not require much capital. So everyone can use its own money. But if you want to upgrade to more capital-intensive industries, you cannot just rely on your own money. You need to have some kind of financial institution to mobilize the financial resources in order to facilitate your upgrading. But individual firm cannot internalize the development of financial institution. You need to have a government help. Not only financial institution, you are going to engage all different kind of trade that also require government, legal structure and so on. And the government need to do that also. Then also externality. When you do the industrial upgradings, it's an innovation. There are some risks involved. Some may be successful, some may be fail, some may fail. But no matter it succeed or fail, they provide some kind of information for other firms. So for the first one, they provide some kind of externality to the other firm. So under this kind of situation, that means the firm, the government, in a developing country can provide a function of gathering information and distribute information in industrial policies. And also, according to this industrial policy, they can coordinate necessary changes in the financial, in the legal structure, and so on, and compensate the firm for them to do the innovations. Okay. So with this, we can compare the performance of a CAD strategy and a performance of CF strategy. For the firm follow the CAD strategies, it will be very hard for them to exploit the advantage of backwardness in technological changes because they want to go into the most advanced technology immediately. And we know the developed country in general have protection that. So it's hard for them to get that. And even they get that, they have to pay a much higher cost. And very often, they cannot get that. They need to do the invention by themselves. But if you follow your CF strategies, you will climb your technological ladder step by step. And each step is very small, so it's very easy for them to learn. And the cost for learning is also small. And secondly, for the country which follow the CAD strategy, at the beginning, they are going to have some kind of investment like growth. But their investment is very inefficient. So they cannot create enough profit or surplus for further investment. So their economy is going to encounter stagnation and so on. But if you follow a CF strategies, each investment going to the sectors which you have competitive advantages, it's going to be very competitive. You can generate a lot of profit, and then those profits can be used for the further investment. So they are going to have a dynamic growth. And also, for a country which follow the CAD strategies, you want to go into the sectors which you do not have competitive advantage, so you reduce your import. And your resources is limited. if you allocate your resources to the sector which you do not have competitive advantage, that means you will allocate less resources to the sector which you have competitive advantage. So their export also hurt. Under this kind of situation, import reduce, export reduce, so they are going to be very inward looking. If you follow your competitive advantage, you give resources to sector which you have competitive advantage, you can export more. And for sector we do not have competitive advantage, you import more. So import and export will be a much larger percentage of your economy. They will appear to be open. Not only so, you have other social consequences. If you try to go against your competitive advantages to sector which you don't have competitive advantage, especially if you are in a market economy, only those rich people will have the resources to invest in the capital-intensive industries. And they receive subsidies for their investment. And the subsidy will come from poor people. So under this kind of situation, the income distribution is going to be polarized. But if you follow your competitive advantages, at the beginning stages, you go into the labor-intensive industries, you create a lot of jobs, and the poor people, they only have the labor force to earn the income. They can be employed, and they can achieve full employment. Not only so, because of quick accumulation of the capitals, gradually capital will become relative abundant, and the labor will become relative scarce. So their wage rate will increase very fast. Under this kind of situation, in the development process, the income distribution can be improved. So from this comparison, we know a CF strategy is much better than a CAD strategy. And my interpretation is that the East Asian economy basically follow the CF strategy. And all other developing countries, including the socialist country, follow the CAD strategy. And that's the reason why small group of East Asian economy was successful and other developing countries will encounter all kinds of failures and consequences. And I'm coming to, because most of the developing countries follow the wrong ideas. And so it caused some kind of, by the time of late 70s, early 80s, they had some kind of capitalist triumphalism, because all the socialist countries follow the CAD strategy fail. And they think it failed because of the socialism. And the succeed of this developed country because they follow capitalist mode of development. And the new social sort is articulated or capitulated in the Washington Consensus, which intends to build up the necessary institution for a well-functioning market economy. I think that the goal or the final destination is good because they wanted to have a market economy. And structurality is a version of the Washington Consensus. And there are three components. One is market liberalization, allow the price to be determined by market competition. The second one is privatization, so the enterprises will have the incentive to respond to the market signals. And the third one is fixed discipline, so you can maintain the stability of the price. If you encounter some kind of high inflation, then price will cease to be the signal for resource allocation, right? So these three components seems to be very good. But the trouble is that after the socialist country adopt this Washington Consensus type of structurality, they're not, their experience is not the J curve, that after a transition decline, they are going to have a very rapid economic recovery and growth. In effect, they encounter something I call L curve. They have a sharp collapse and stagnated for a long time and started to recover gradually. In other developing countries, follow the Washington Consensus in their reform, they encounter similar things. And we know that China and Vietnam did not adopt this structurality. And what's wrong with the Washington Consensus? I think it was because, as I mentioned, they treat the distortion in the socialist and developing country as exogenous. However, as I just argued, those distortions are some kind of second-best arrangement. It's endogenous for protecting the large number of non-viable firms in the country. And under this kind of situation, in effect, structurality will encounter something I call triangle of impossibility. Because privatization will worsen the so-based constraint. after the privatization, private firm will argue for more protection instead of less protection. The reason is that the firm in the priority sector still encounters some kind of non-viability issue, policy burdens. And since it's a policy burden, the government is responsible to give them protections. And the privatized firm, private owner certainly will have a higher incentive to argue for protection than the manager of a public-owned firm. Because for the manager of a state-owned firm, they cannot pocket the subsidies from the government. And for the private firm, the more the government give them protection, the more they can put them into their pocket. However, the privatization will weaken the government's ability to collect tax, right? So on the one hand, your tax collection reduced, but on the other hand, you need to give more protection. So under the kind of situation, you cannot really have the stability in the macroeconomy. And a structural upheaval will lead to some kind of high inflation. And that is as evidenced in Russia and other East European countries. And this chart shows that during the transition period, some countries even have an inflation rate of more than 100,000, right? In China, we now adopt a different approach. And the approach is capitulate in Deng Xiaoping's two sayings. The first one is no matter it's a white cat or a black cat, as long as you can catch mouse, it is a good cat, right? But for transition, more important is the second one. The transition is just like to cross the river by grabbing the stones. But the destination is clear. We want to change from a traditional planned economy to a market economy. That is the outside of the river. But how to cross the river is not to jump. We need to see what is the constraint, what's the opportunity, and move step by step. And the way of step by step is a dual-track approach, and Professor Lau is an authority on this issue. So China adopted a dual-track approach in the transition. First, given some kind of partial autonomy to the farmers and state-owned workers, working in the state-owned enterprises, to improve their incentive. Since their incentive is improved, certainly their productivity increase, the output increase. Then introduce some kind of dual track in price and resource allocation. Allow the private firm or the farmer to make an investment depends on for those resources they obtain. But however, the government still requires the state-owned firm and the farmer to deliver certain quota to the state. And also the state will have the ability to subsidize those kind of non-viable firms. So by this, only after a sector's most of the output has been produced in the market track, they will liberalize that. And this approach, in effect, achieves stability because states still own enough resources to protect those kind of non-viable firms. However, provide the incentive and improvement in resource allocation so you can have economic dynamics at the same time. And if we look carefully, all countries which succeed in their transition, in their spirit, they all follow similar type of strategy. Vietnam is a good example, and Mauritius in Africa, also another example. When they try to transit in those kind of inward-looking strategy to a more outward-looking strategies, they also adopt this kind of dual track. Protect the inefficient firm at the beginning and allow more autonomy to the firm to enter in the sector which they have competitive advantages. So this spirit is universal. Then why East Asian are so special? I mentioned that Japan and the Four Dragons were the only group of economy which were successful in their development attempts. And China and Vietnam are the major countries which successful in their transition process. They are all in East Asia. How come East Asian country economy are so special? Because the government, I think idea is so important. And certainly the intellectual leaders and the government in East Asia were influenced by the similar social thought, right? Like in the 1950s, Taiwan also wanted to develop heavy industry in order to prepare themselves for 反攻大陆, right? However, for the East Asian economy, they were constrained by the scarcity in the natural endowment. in their choice of strategy, of the CAD strategy. Because CAD strategy is very inefficient. And from what I see, how long you can sustain those kind of strategies depends on how rich your natural resources and how large your population are. And we know East Asian economy, they are extremely poor in the natural endowment. And their population size was not large. So under this kind of situation, whenever they try to pursue this kind of CAD strategy, immediately they encounter high inflation. Because the government need to use deficit budget in order to make those kind of investment. And they are going to have high inflation. And this occurred in the 1950s in Taiwan and also 1970s in Korea. Because of high inflation, the government was unable to subsidize the priority sectors. Without subsidies to the priority sectors, certainly a firm will follow the market principle to make their own investment. So in effect, they follow this kind of CF strategy by default, not by design. And also, not only in the development and in the transition, this kind of resources constraint also demonstrated in the Chinese philosophy, Chinese culture. Like in China, we say, politically, you need to follow 中庸, keep the golden mean. You cannot go to the extreme. And you need to be pragmatic, right, in the political policies, because you need to find in truth from the facts, 实事求是. And also you need to liberalize your mind from the dogmatism. You cannot be too dogmatic, you cannot be too ideological. And also you need to adapting your policy to the changing environment. All those reflect the resources constraint on the economic and political choices, and that's part of the culture. So from this, I would say, I say at the beginning, there are some hypotheses to explain why some countries are more successful than the other country. Some say luck, some say geography, some say culture. And arguably, those do have some explanation power for the success of East Asian success story in the development and the transition. So the lesson I learned, for the transition, it's important to take measures to improve incentive first, because all the countries, they have some kind of distortion in their institution. They supply incentive. And if you can take measures to improve the incentive, it will increase the output, the productivity, you have new student resources that you can allocate. Then you introduce a dual track system, allow entry to the replaced sectors, and continue to provide necessary support to the non-viable form. Then you can achieve stability and also dynamic growth simultaneously. Then liberalizing a sector where most products in those sectors are allocated by markets. Then you can jump across the narrow rivers. And you also need to continuously introduce necessary regulation and law to strengthen the market institution, because market institution is fundamental, as I mentioned. So my final concluding remarks. Technology upgrading is the most important driving force for long-term dynamic growth. It's a truth in any stage of development and in any country. And the government is the most important institution in a developing country, as its policy determines the quality of other institutions in the country. Institution is important, but the quality of the institution are shaped by the quality of government's policies. And ideas or dominant social thought is the most important determinant of the quality of a country's policy and institution. If you have wrong ideas, you will adopt wrong policy, and you're going to have bad institution. If you have right ideas, you adopt a right policy, and you're going to have good institution. And the endowment is the most important binding constraint in a country's choice of technology and industries. Endowment determines the total budget in a country. Endowment will also determine the relative price of different factors. And for economists, we know that total budget and the relative price are two most important economic parameters. And endowment capture these two parameters in one factors. And I think it's most important in our constraint. But so far, we do not pay enough attention to the endowment structure and its effect on the choice of technology, industry, and so on. And the comparative advantage is the most important guiding principle for formulating development policies. But unfortunately, most studies, theory in the development policy try to go against their comparative advantages. They use infant industry hypothesis, they use externality, and so on. But if you look carefully, in all their model, they assume the country's endowment is the same. So they ignore that. Certainly, if you ignore the endowment, then externality will be important, and the infant industrial hypothesis will be important. However, they forget the most important one, that is endowment. And the viability is the most important concept to understand the cause of distortion in a country, in an economy. So far, we pay too much attention to the West interest group. But for the developing country, I think the viability issue is more important, more fundamental than the West interest group conflicts. And the pragmatism is the most important policy guidance for economic transition, for economic reform. You need to understand the reality to seek what is opportunity and to tap into that opportunity. And that opportunity will be different from country to other country, will be different from states to the next stages. And from that, I'm confident, I'm optimistic. Just like Arthur Lewis in one of his famous books, a theory of economic growth, he say, all nations have opportunities which they may grasp if only they can sum up the courage and the will. And it is possible for a nation to take a new turn if it is fortunate to have the right leadership at the right time, so they can adopt the right policy to remove the constraint and to facilitate dynamic growth. And I think certainly how to do that require knowledge, require ideas. And I say the success of East Asian economy was by default. But hopefully, with our improvement in knowledge, we can have a design policy, just like Engels in one of his very influential quotations saying, freedom of the will means nothing but the capacity to make decisions with knowledge of the subject. And I hope this lecture will help me and help you to understand the subject of development and a transition so we can have a design strategy, design policy to promote development and to facilitate transition. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lin, for your most inspiring lecture. Professor Lin has kindly agreed to take a few questions from the audience. If you would like to raise any questions, please raise your hands and our staff will pass you a mic. May I invite Professor Lawrence Lau to conduct the question and answer session. Professor Lau, please.
Let us give Professor Lin another hand for a very insightful lecture. Okay, the floor is now open for questions. The ground rules are you have to tell us your name, and also the limit is one question per person. All right, all right, please. Go ahead.
My name is David Fong. This year we're celebrating the 30th anniversary of China's open economic policy. China is very successful in moving from an agricultural-based economy to an industrial-based economy. But given China's huge country population, the strategic importance of its agricultural and energy sector, do you agree that China should not blindly allocate a lot of resources in developing its third sectors without examining its comparative advantages?
Well, if you look into the experience of development in any other countries, they all started with 80% or even 90% of the population labor force in agriculture. That when they reach the modernization, the people in agriculture will reduce to less than 5%. And I think that is a process China will also go through, right? And if you achieve your modernization, your income become bigger. Under this kind of situation, we have more resources to allocate to agricultural sectors to improve their productivities. And under that kind of situation, even you only have less than 5% of population in agriculture, you will be able to produce enough agricultural output for your own consumption, or you will have enough resources to import agricultural commodities for your own consumption. So I would say in China, similarly, we will be on the same process. We started with, at the beginning of the reform, 75% of the population in agriculture. Now it's reduced to about 55%. And I'm going to see the further decline in the agricultural population. However, under this kind of situation, certainly the government needs to improve the agricultural infrastructures. The government needs to invest in agricultural technology so the people remain in the agricultural sectors will have ability to improve their productivities. And that is so-called the new countryside strategy that the Chinese government is adopting now.
Raymond, please.
The new labor laws in China,
Yeah.
are they economically efficient?
Yeah.
Or do you think they are second-best solutions to difficulties in pricing externalities like pollution?
Well, I think the new labor contract law received a lot of attention. And I hear different people give different responses. For many people who are in the more advanced modern sectors, they think that this law is good because they already give those kind of protection to the workers. And in the past, they have to face unequal competition because some firm in the more traditional or more backward sectors, they did not give enough protection to labor. And for enterprises in the more traditional or more low value-added sectors, they think that the labor contract law will increase their cost. And this kind of increase in cost certainly temporarily will reduce their profitability and competitiveness. But from what I see, this is a direction that all the country need to go. Certainly we hope the stage of development or the economic development will bring more and more protection and more income to the workers. And it is a stage that we need to go through. And when you try to introduce a new law regulation, certainly you are going to cost some adjustment cost for some firm. And so my advice to the firm in the more low value-added sectors and so on is that they have to face this sooner or later. And then when they face now, they have to accommodate that kind of changes because that will be a trend no one can reverse.
Thank you. Paul Chang.
I'm Paul Chang. Since we can only ask one question, can I have two parts to the question?
Okay, let's see which two parts. That's cheating a little bit. But
I think recently both China and Vietnam are experiencing high inflation.
Yeah.
Can you make some comments on that?
Yeah.
And talking about high inflation, Hong Kong is also raising the inflation sort of head.
Yeah.
And a lot of people feel that we should now unpeg it against the US dollar
Yeah.
and go to a basket of currencies,
Yeah.
while the government is adamant that this is not one issue that we should discuss.
Yeah.
Can you give us your views, please?
Yeah. I think for the high inflation in China, in Vietnam, and also in many other developed countries also, I think the reason, first, because of increase in the commodity price and increase in the prices of natural resources, and certainly that will affect the price level in all the countries in the world. But for China, I think in addition to this kind of imported inflation, it was because of this high investment growth rate, high consumption growth rate, high urbanization rate, and all create a huge demand. In addition to that, also because of the weathers this year reduced the agricultural product, and that contribute to this high consumer price index. From what I see, China may enter into a period of higher inflation rate than what we used to have in the period of 2003 to 2006. The main reason is that the period of starting in 2003 was Chinese economy just got out of the deflation in the period of 1998 to 2002. The reason of deflation was because you have excess capacity, excess supply in all the major sectors. So price continued to drop. And after 2003, we have, each year, high investment growth rate, high consumption growth rate, high export growth rate. At the beginning, because of excess capacity in all the major sectors, even those kind of high growth rate in investment, consumption, and export pushed up the price in certain sectors. But other sector price continued to drop. So the overall consumer price index or retail price index remained at about 1 or 2%. But after 5 years of dynamic growth, most of the excess capacity has been absorbed. So under this kind of situation, economy is in a relatively equilibrium in the supply and demand. And with that as a foundation, if you have high investment growth rate or high consumption growth rate or export growth rate or commodity price increase in the international market or some kind of natural weather effect in agricultural production, you're going to have inflation rate. From what I see, in the coming years, at least high investment growth rate, high consumption growth rate, and most likely, high international commodity price and fuel price will be there. So I would say the inflation rate in China is likely to be around 5 or 6% this year or coming years. It's a question I think you have more people with authority on that issue here.
Please.
Yeah, Professor, I'd like to ask you this. I've met a lot of foreign experts writing books on China's development, etc.
Yeah.
But when I ask that question, I don't think anybody give me a satisfactory answer, even though they are China experts.
Yeah.
What is really socialism with special Chinese characteristics? And is what you said, well, my understanding was China is doing today is exactly what capitalist countries during their development.
Yeah.
So is that only a slogan, or is that something that the leadership could use that, in fact, I asked quite a few leaders of China about the same question. Is that some kind of a language that they use to just try to say China is still a socialist country?
Yeah. Well, you know that Deng Xiaoping said that no matter it's a white cat or it's a black cat, as long as it can catch mouse, it's a good cat. And I can say that as long as it can catch mouse, it's a socialist cat. Because according to Deng Xiaoping, the 3 criteria to judge a policy or institution is socialist or not. It's first one, whether it improves productivity, whether it improves the well-being of the people, whether it improves the wealth of the nation. Any policy fulfill these 3 criteria is socialist policy. Yeah, and so this socialist policy is certainly different from the socialist policies in the book of Marx or in a system in other socialist countries. So we need to put that into a socialism with Chinese characteristics.
Questions? Okay, gentleman, way back.
Good afternoon. I'm a CHK student studying in the Faculty of Business Administration in my freshman year. And during your lecture, you have emphasized several times about the continuous technology innovation.
Right.
It's the key to the developing countries' economic growth.
Yeah.
So, and while the institutions are the key, plays a key role in that.
Yeah.
So, would you mind giving us a brief comparison between the USA university education and Chinese university education?
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. I mean that institution will provide the incentive for people to do certain things. If your institution encourages creativity, then people will certainly pursue creativity. If your institution of education emphasize memory of the existing theory, then certainly people will devote time to remember the theory of the books, right? So certainly the education institution will be important for what kind of incentive people have. And in effect, that's the reason why we want to have the educational institutional reform in Hong Kong, and to bring Professor Lau and other international renowned economists to Hong Kong. And in China, we also, in the same process, try to encourage students to be exploring, to be curious about the world, instead of just memorize what is written in the books.
Okay. Let me see, the gentleman, fourth row.
Professor Lee, I'm Adam Tertag. I'm the Consul General of Hungary. And you were speaking about the Washington Consensus.
Yeah.
And you know that the IMF and the World Bank was quite strongly advising the transition economies in Central Europe. Now, excuse me for my provocative question, but where will you start your work at the World Bank? Because some of those advices by the World Bank to those Central European economies were putting them on the track of the CAD strategy. And now my question is that how you are bringing the World Bank and the IMF to go to the right strategy.
I think I'm a lucky person. I returned to China in 1979, and China started to have the market-oriented reform in 1979. If you do some kind of econometrics work, I can claim I started the reform and a transition in China. But certainly, I did not start that. And now I come to World Bank. I think I'm a lucky person because in World Bank, now they have a lot of reflection about the Washington Consensus. And now they start to appreciate the experience, those kind of pragmatism, gradualism from China. So that's why they hire me to there. And I think because they already see their strategies, their perception. So I think I'm going to have a very enabling environment for my work. And maybe in the future, people will claim that I start this kind of transition. And I'll be happy to get that friend, but in effect, I'm just lucky because they already start to have these changes.
Francis?
I have a easy question for you about the Pearl River Delta. In recent months, there seems to be a lot of Hong Kong investors moving away from the Pearl River Delta. These people seem to be facing a dilemma. Labor cost there is going up. Now they may have, say, two choices: either to upgrade the technology and or just to go away to another labor abundant region. And then if they go away, then they will just be repeating almost exactly the same kind of story that they had before. Now, in your opinion, what strategy should they follow? Should they stay and then upgrade their technology, or should they just go away to Yunnan or to Tibet? Well, maybe not Tibet. Okay, maybe to some other places. Okay.
Yeah, I would say that eventually China will become richer and richer. Labor cost in China, no matter it's because of labor contract law or the shortage in labor supply, the wage rate will come up. And this no matter where they go, will be the unavoided trend. So overall, I think to introduce better technology, better management, to pursue high value added would be a much better strategies. And certainly whether a firm can follow that or not, it will depend on their entrepreneurship, their access to technologies, their access to financial market and so on. And to help them, I think that the government, the financial sectors, and so on can also provide some kind of enabling, facilitating environment for them to pursue this kind of upgrading. I think that will be a much better situation than just to simply try to avoid or try to get away.
Questions? Please identify yourself.
Okay. Hello, Professor Lin. I'm Watson from business faculty. I recently I'm very interested in economics, and I know you are a great economist, and I want to know what makes you a good economist, especially when you are in university in your university. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I beg your pardon. I did not fully get your question. What is my?
I just want to know what makes you a very excellent economics.
Make me a good economist. I think that everyone can be good economist if you study hard, if you not only base your judgment by the book, but try to understand the phenomena, then you can be a good economist. And you can make a contribution to economic theory because all new theory comes from new phenomena. And now we are in China, and there's a lot of new puzzling phenomena. And if you spend time to improve your skills, improve your abilities, and at the same time you have active interest in economic phenomena, I'm sure you can be a good economist.
Okay, we have one last question. Professor Lee?
Professor Lin, I'm not an economist, but I've been told that economics is common sense spoken in a language that no one can understand.
True.
But today I understand your lecture very well.
Yeah.
And I do have this question. You mentioned that for leaders, they must have good new ideas.
Yeah.
At the same time, you said leaders must carry the social thought with them. In other words, public opinion.
Yeah.
What happens if the good ideas and the public opinion are in conflict?
Yeah.
For instance, like introducing a new tax like GST or VAT, and no public will agree to a new tax.
Yeah. Well, I have a professor in Chicago called George Stigler. He said that an economist is just like a preacher. You have a conviction of yourself, and you also need to convince the other people. And that's the reason why I come to give a lecture today here.
Well, okay. Can we give Professor Lin another quick hand? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Lin and Professor Lau. Please remain on stage. To show our appreciation, may I invite Professor Lau to present a souvenir to Professor Lin. Gentlemen, please. This is a painting of the campus of the Chinese University of Hong Kong by internationally acclaimed artist, director of the Art Academy in Beijing, Wang Mingming, during his stay at the university as an artist in residence. We hope that this painting will remind Professor Lin of the beautiful campus of the Chinese University. May I also invite Dr. Ying Chen to join in this group photo. Dr. Chen, please.